Lots of people, including myself, love to watch and feed wild birds from the backyard, but is it bad to feed wild birds? Now, I've worked with a lot of birds professionally throughout my career under human care, and I spent a lot of my career teaching kids about what we can do for wildlife. Now, there's always some kid that's like, oh, we can feed the animals and that will help them. And while that's like a genuine and kind-hearted answer, there's definitely a thin line with feeding animals on where it can help them or where it can do harm for them. So I'm sitting at home watching these birds thinking, well, I spend so much time at work telling kids, no, just don't feed animals. And then I go out and spend hundreds of dollars on bird feeders and seed. So is it actually bad to feed wild birds? At this point, I have a few questions on feeding wild birds. 1, is it bad and harmful to feed wild birds? 2, if it's not, what is the best way to feed them and what feeders are best? 3, are there certain foods that I should or should not be feeding wild birds? And 4, are there certain times of year where I should or shouldn't be feeding wild birds? So to talk about the concerns with my first question, is it harmful to feed wild birds? Well, wild animals that are fed by humans may end up relying on those people for that food, and they don't learn those foraging strategies for themselves in order to survive. If those people end up disappearing, or like if tourist season is over, they may be stuck not knowing how to get their own food. And if they're approaching humans for food, that could be dangerous because they could either get frustrated if they don't have food, and that could lead to bites or the person getting scared and hurting the animal, or it could reinforce the fact that people do have food for them if they do end up feeding them, and then they just rely on them more. And with birds, if they're getting food from a feeder instead of having that natural cycle of the seeds and the bugs and things going through and then kind of tapering off, which kind of can tell them it's time to migrate, maybe they won't end up migrating. Feeding also just kind of in general throws a curveball into that whole process of evolution and natural selection. Are they not getting those characteristics that they need to survive in their environment if those feeders end up going away? Or are they adapting to living around humans and that gives them a better advantage? So those were kind of all the thoughts that were going through my head on if it is okay to feed wild birds or not. So I tried to do a little bit of digging into what the world's leading organizations on birds say about feeding wild birds. There's still a lot to be learned about the outcomes of having feeder versus non-feeder birds. In general, it seems the feeder birds do fare better according to the Cornell Lab's Project Feeder Watch. And the connection people gain to these animals by feeding them is important for promoting conservation. This study from the University of Wisconsin found there was no evidence that bird feeding promotes dependency when they were comparing monthly survival rates of black-capped chickadees that had used feeders in the past and those that had not. So in general, it seems like it is okay to feed wild birds if you are willing to clean out the feeders occasionally. Birds gathering in one area can lead to the spread of disease. The more animals you have in a group, the easier it is for disease to spread. So if you're not going to clean out the feeders, you actually can be doing more damage to the health of those birds because when birds gather in one place, there's more possibility for diseases to spread. And if you're not disinfecting those feeders occasionally, those diseases can spread to your birds and make them sick. When it comes time to clean your bird feeders, go ahead and dump out your old bird seed, get all the debris out, and dump it into your compost, and then start rinsing it out. So put it in a 9-to-1 solution of water to bleach, let it soak in there for 10 minutes, and then rinse it off and dry it in the sun. And make sure it's completely dry before you put bird seed back into it. Do that a couple of times this season just to make sure you're not getting buildup and debris and there's not like mold and pathogens that are staying on your bird feeder. So what's the best way to feed wild birds? So you have two options. You can either use natural plants and shrubs to have them forage more naturally, and that's probably the best way. It gives you a nice landscape and it also helps them find food in a more natural way. And there's also feeders. So not everybody has the land to put up those shrubs and those trees or the budget to do that. So a feeder is a really nice alternative to that. Plus, you can see those birds a little more easily, and that does help people connect to those birds a little bit better. Feeder types include seed, hopper, and platform feeders. And depending on what type of seed you're using too and what type of feeder, you're gonna have to figure out if it's supposed to be low to the ground, kind of in the middle, or really high up because they feed at different levels. One thing you want to do is learn a little bit about the birds in your area and what type of foods attract them. and if it's a common bird or not so common. I shouldn't spend all my time trying to attract a roseate spoonbill to my yard because there was one seen a few miles away from here like a few years ago. Is it possible? Yeah. Is it likely? No. I don't have the right habitat, and it's really, really rare to see one of those birds around in here in Minnesota. So learn what birds are common in your area and go from there. I'll put some links to some resources down below that you can check out. But Project Feeder Watch lets you search by the region, food type, and feeder type. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a list of best trees, vines, and shrubs to plant for birds. And you can check out the Habitat Network from the Nature Conservancy and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for local resources in your zip code. It is best to stick with one type of seed per feeder, especially if you're getting like some picky birds and they only want like the sunflower seed. They'll throw out all the other junk in between to get to that one type of seed. So then you're just attracting pests, which can spread disease as well, like mice. And if you're just overwhelmed with information and you're like, I just want to put out some seeds and see some birds, go with the black oil or the striped sunflower seeds. Just throw those out. That's going to give you a good variety of birds. Or you can try thistle or Niger seeds for attracting finches.
We are making mess.
That's okay.
Little bit.
Okay.
When it comes to foods that you shouldn't be feeding wild birds, you don't ever really want to feed them like chocolate or bread, and feeding waterfowl like ducks and geese is pretty frowned upon in general, especially when you're feeding them bread. It's just not good for them. You should never ever add dyes to your hummingbird feeders. It should be white sugar and water and nothing else. They don't need the red dye. Avoid birdseed mixes with fillers like oats or red millet. Never feed raw peanuts or ones with salt or sugar added, just the roasted peanuts. And if your birdseed is getting clumpy, moldy, has sprouts in it, stinks really bad, or is really attracting a lot of insects, get rid of it. As far as when to feed birds or not feed birds, only give them suet during the cooler months, because if that melts, it can go rancid, and then if it gets on their feathers, that can make the birds unhealthy. Avoid feeding peanuts in the spring or summer, because if parent birds bring those to their chicks, they could choke on those, and they don't really need that fatty peanut in the spring and summer anyways. If you're going to feed wild birds in the summer, which isn't totally necessary, but make it a high protein meal. Fall and winter feedings should be consistent if you do decide to feed wild birds, and they should be high fat meals. Depending on where you live, you may want to feed hummingbirds all year round. If you live here in Minnesota, April to November is a good time to have those feeders out, and wait until 2 weeks after you see your last hummingbird to keep it out in order to keep those late migrators fed.